Thanks everyone. I might just get started. Looks like most people should be here now. So we have a webinar today by Dr. Ian Moffat from Flinders University. But just before we move into that, just a couple of housekeeping and introductory slides to go through. So my name's Kate Robertson. I'm the President-elect of the ASEG, but I have my South Australian Northern Territory branch hat on today. So I'm a committee member on that branch. Before we get started, I'd like to say a big thank you to our corporate members. So our corporate members help to support the ASEG with the financial contribution that supports the events that we run, the publications that we produce, and many of our sort of ongoing activities. And also they support our research foundation. So the research foundation contributes to geophysics honours, masters and PhD students. So big thank you to our Corporate Plus members, High Size, Total Seismic and Bell Size. And also thank you to our corporate members, Archimedes Financial Planning, Southern Geoscience Consultants, GDD Instrumentation Inc., Santos and SA Exploration. Also a big thank you to our branch sponsors, which usually would help to contribute to the regular technical events that we are holding, which currently are online. So we have sponsors in particular for the South Australian Northern Territory branch, Western Australia branch and New South Wales branch. So thank you very much. And if you're interested in becoming a branch sponsor or a corporate member, please see our website or contact any of the committee for more details. Just one slide on Zoom etiquette. So we will be having a Q&A session with Ian at the end. And if you want to ask questions, you can ask them as they pop into your head throughout the talk using the Q&A function, which will probably be at the bottom of your screen. If not, maybe you could find in the participants section. And there's also a chat function as well. And so the other option at the end during the questions is you can use the raise hand function or just type, I have a question, and you can we can unmute your microphone and you can ask it that way if you'd prefer. I think that's all for housekeeping. And we have a couple of, well, more than a couple, we have many upcoming webinars and we're regularly updating this. Our next one is on the 11th of June, 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. This is by Dr. Anand Roy at Geoscience Australia on probabilistic seismic full waveform inversion. I won't go through the lengthy list of talks that are on there, but you can find them all on the ASEG website. If you can't find what you're looking for, just check again because we're constantly updating. And these are also promoted on our social media as well. And most, if not all of these will be available on our ASEG YouTube channel. Just a reminder of the benefits of becoming an ASEG member. We produce a technical journal, Exploration Geophysics, which comes out every couple of months. And so you get free access to this high quality journal, a free copy of Preview, the ASEG magazine, which has geophysics news, exploration news, and lots of other interesting content. Reduced entry to AEGC conferences, which are held every 18 months. Reduced entry to technical events, social events. We have our annual wine offer. And of course, the benefits of being a member of a professional network. We also support students with research, travel funds, and the Research Foundation. And if you are a student, it's free to sign up, so no excuses there. And conditions apply, but there is generally half price membership for retirees and recent graduates. Don't forget to follow us on social media. And with that, I think we'll jump into Ian's talk, which is titled Searching for the Beaumont Children and Other Adventures in Unmarked Grave Detection. So thanks, Ian, and I'll turn off my screen sharing and hopefully you should be able to start yours.
Perfect. Thanks very much for inviting me along, Kate. I'm absolutely thrilled to to be here virtually today and to be talking about the use of geophysics in unmarked grave detection. I thought before I dive in, so to speak, to the topic, I might just give a short introduction to my background. I'm a senior research fellow in archaeological science at Flinders University. I've previously held research positions at the University of Cambridge and in the Institute of Mediterranean Studies in Crete. And I did my PhD in strontium isotope geochemistry at the ANU. And the sort of work that we're doing in this sort of earth science archaeology crossover space at Flinders, I think, is really exciting. I've got a bunch of great grad students here that are using geophysical and geomatic techniques to look at archaeological sites on a landscape scale. So some examples here, a classical city in the Peloponnese of Greece on the right of your screen that was mapped with magnetics and EM as part of a study of the organization of urban space in these really interesting sites. Using GPR on the upper left to look at the hydrology of a reservoir from an Angkorian period city in Cambodia. And on the bottom left, looking at the sort of depositional environments in a Neolithic site in Mongolia. I'm also really interested in using strontium and oxygen isotope measurements to look at biogenic carbonates, including this example of a Neanderthal on the right in this image. And I'm doing a lot of work applying geophysical and geochemical techniques to the depositional history of archaeological cave sites, such as this one in Arnhem Land, looking at questions like depth to bedrock, position of bits of roof fall in the sediment packages, and trying to look at the kind of stratigraphic architecture of these really, really interesting locations. And finally, doing some really interesting 3D modeling and aerial survey work on rock art sites in Arnhem Land. So I'm really always interested in hearing from great potential students with skills in with geophysics and geology. And so if you are interested in doing a PhD or a master's, please don't hesitate to send me an email after the talk. I'd be really interested to talk to you about some of this work. But today I'm going to talk about burials in cemeteries and in other sites. And this, interestingly, is the thing that led me into archaeology. I was trained as a geologist, and I was working for a near-surface geophysics consultancy. And we kept getting inquiries from councils and Indigenous groups to map unmarked graves in the cemeteries. That led me to start doing a bit of casual teaching at Flinders, and now, many years later, I seem to be here full time. So this is something that I guess I didn't think about as a geology undergraduate student at all, but this is such a central problem from a cultural heritage management and forensic point of view that I think it's really deserving of much more attention. As it says on the slide, at the West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, there's something like 50,000 unmarked graves known to exist just on that site. And then as you extrapolate that question out into more regional areas, generally the knowledge of those locations gets worse and worse. And so you have a really big problem where many groups are struggling to understand how to address this. And I think this is very important from a whole range of perspectives. There's something I think so evocative about a cemetery as a symbol of community history. I think particularly for community groups that have relatives or ancestors in those places, it's such a tangible and immediate link to the past. They're fascinating also from the point of view of the inscription on the headstones, the little snippets of information that, that these really interesting locations preserve. But as I've said, almost every cemetery that I've ever been involved in has got a problem with unmarked graves. This, and this is not really due to a systematic problem in record keeping. It's more commonly, for example, that the headstones were made of wood and they've broken down over time. The records were kept on paper and have been lost in the various changes of parishes and churches and councils, or indeed pre-refrigeration. If somebody has passed away, they really need to be buried very quickly. And in regional areas, that might preclude the use of a sort of a standard undertaker, and these things might be done in a slightly more haphazard fashion. This also question bridges outside of the cemeteries to other important issues like forensic investigations, looking for areas for the reburial of Indigenous skeletal material. I'll talk about this later in the presentation, but this is, again, a very important cultural heritage management issue where Indigenous people are being returned to country from museum and university collections and wish to be buried in locations that don't disturb existing burials. And finally, from a commercial point of view, of course, housing and big industrial developments can disturb areas of known burial, either historic or Indigenous. And this is and using geophysics is a really rapid and culturally appropriate way to address this question. And so, as a result of all of these points, I've spent a huge amount of time pushing a GPR around cemeteries. Because and I'm preaching to the converted with this audience, but the ability to do non-invasive investigation, particularly over large or poorly understood sites, is just so attractive in this context. I've got an image on the left of a alleged site of frontier conflict in Northern Australia, and we're digging a trench to look for possible disturbance due to burials. Compared to that on the right, doing some GPR survey in Kiribati to try to find World War II graves. Maybe this is reflected in my portly physique, but I know which of those two things I would prefer to be doing. However, it's not all good news. So most non-geophysicists are surprised to hear this, but unfortunately, directly detecting skeletal material with geophysical techniques is almost always impossible. Now, those of you that have delved into the literature might argue with me about this. There's certainly many cases where people have done some really interesting experimental work, particularly using GPR to directly image skeletal material. There's been some great lab studies done with tanks of sand and bones inside them that have worked very well. And there has been a number of studies done on actual sites as well that have located these burials, doing things like putting pig cadavers in the ground and then measuring the response over time. And so that's why I say almost impossible, but for those of us that have to work in the real world and deal with sites where there's tree roots, where we don't understand the history very well, where we're covering large areas under uncertain field conditions, it is almost always impossible to reliably see these very subtle features in amongst the muddle of other subsurface information that's coming back. So if somebody could convince a government on my behalf to make our bones be made out of another more detectable material, this example where there's a whole bunch of GPR hyperbola related to burials is really instructive. These are American servicemen that have been buried wearing their helmets, and they show up really well. And I'd be happy to, and probably would have far more hair myself if I did this sort of work all the time. But unfortunately, if we're stuck with people that are buried without metal, we need to look for another way forward. And the way that can be done is by looking for the soil disturbance, or occasionally the material culture items, but generally the soil disturbance related to digging a grave. So basically what's happening is when a grave is dug, the soil layers on the site are completely mixed up. And when that mixed up material is put back into the grave, it has lost that stratigraphy for a really significant period of time. And so by doing, in this case, GPR across the site, you can map all of those soil disturbances and collate them together to see if the disturbance is of a appropriate size to be an unmarked grave of a person. This is quite a complex thing, and what it does require in abundance is high density geophysical data. So this is an example in the image of a GPR survey at an Adelaide Metro cemetery where we're using a 20 centimetre line spacing, and that provides the opportunity to see each individual grave again and again and plot its distribution out over the site. This also relies on really high quality positioning information and detailed site recording to ensure that the interpretation of these key features is informed by the site conditions, and that for this sort of level of accuracy, the anomalies are appropriately lined up across the site to aid in the spatial interpretation. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the geophysical techniques that are used for grave detection. I don't want to dwell on this. I think most people in the audience know more about them than me, but in terms of a general tool for doing grave detection, ground penetrating radar absolutely is the hero. This rapid data collection that's allowed with GPR, the easy integration with centimetre accurate positioning, and the ability to resolve soil stratigraphy makes this the absolute winner for most geophysical investigations of unmarked graves. But there are cases where GPR isn't the best tool. Certainly if there's an issue with getting enough depth for investigation in a conductive soil, ERT can be a really effective alternative. Or if there's a situation where the soil stratigraphy is completely disturbed, such that finding that grave cut is impossible, then and there's an association perhaps with material culture items or burning, then EMI or MAG can be really appropriate methods in those cases as well. But in 99% of projects, if people are looking for unmarked graves, they will use GPR. So I talked about the need for high quality positioning and site mapping, and since the ubiquity of drone photogrammetry in archaeology, this has become far easier. Previously, we would do a lot of kite-based photogrammetry, which is still effective, but it's obviously very weather dependent. Whereas now the drone survey work is just a completely standard part of this investigation. And what it allows, as in this example on the left from the Walkerville Wesleyan Cemetery in the inner northern suburbs of Adelaide, is the opportunity to put your GPR or ERT lines in a lot of detail around key site features. So here we're able to get in amongst all of the graves and survey these areas in a way that's simply impractical from a field time point of view to do with traditional sort of gridding and standard survey techniques. So this has been a really fantastic development for this area and something that we now use as a matter of course. And this is just showing the process of making these photogrammetry models. This is the Walkerville Wesleyan Cemetery again. They're from a whole range of heights and orientations because this was in fact a kite survey. similarly, I'm going to talk about the Battle of Tarawa in much more detail. So we were able to fly surveys over the entire island of Tarawa and provide a very high resolution base map. And this can be used for elevation modeling. And just for fun, we compared some of the kite data to the best possible satellite information we could find. And we can't quite read the headstones, but we're getting pretty close. So this is a really nice tool for integrating with geophysical data in these circumstances. So what is the outcome of these investigations? And this is not a trivial question, actually, because it depends very much on the outcome that the client or the research partner wants out of the unmarked grave detection. If you're working on a forensic project, what police will generally want is the most likely or the most prospective target or series of targets. So the focus is really on narrowing down the survey area to a smaller target that allows direct investigation. In the case of mapping unmarked graves in cemeteries, the question is almost the opposite one. So in this case, people are looking to exclude areas of the site from future burials normally where there is any chance of encountering unmarked graves. And generally communities in this situation are more interested in definitely not disturbing graves. And so they would like you to be more rather than less conservative about how you provide your interpretation. And this can be really a challenging thing to get right because often as a geophysicist, you're operating without a huge knowledge of the site and you're trying to interpret a large amount of geophysical data in such a way to make it accessible. So what I've done in this case is come up with a sort of schema of probable, possible, unlikely graves, and in this case, multiple graves. So these are areas of soil disturbance that are bigger than an individual grave area, but may contain one or more burials. So I've framed the overall use of geophysics in this context, and now I'd like to talk about a couple of case studies where these methods have been used. The first is a charming little cemetery just out of Port Elliot in South Australia. This is essentially just a paddock these days, but it was formerly the Little Glory Church and Cemetery. There was a chapel on site here from 1857, and there's currently 2 marked graves up in the northern extent of the cemetery. This is a really interesting site because the descendant of the undertaker here, who was mostly the town carpenter, but occasionally because of his skills in coffin building, stepped across to do the burials. His great-granddaughter is now the president of the National Trust in Port Elliot. And so she approached me to do this study. She's got a comprehensive list of burials from the site, but absolutely no map or idea where they are. They do know that there was a chapel building here which has been demolished, which was also something that the community was interested in mapping. And this is a really, I guess what you'd call a bog standard community GPR survey looking for unmarked graves. We did just under 170 GPR lines on 0.5 meter spacing across the entire open area of the cemetery, made an aerial photo and then pulled it together for interpretation. And what we found is that there are there's quite a number of unmarked graves, and the former church is located exactly in the centre of the site and corresponds very well to the description of it that we have. but we've got 28 probable, 24 possible, and a few areas with additional graves. This lined up almost exactly with the records that the National Trust holds, and so they were really thrilled with the outcome, and it's a really interesting little insight into the history of Port Elliot. I want to talk about another cemetery site, but one where the geophysics was used in a slightly different way. This is the cemetery of the former Lake Condah mission, which is in Western Victoria. It's very close to the very famous Lake Condah eel traps, which has just been listed for World Heritage in the last 12 months or so. This cemetery was associated with a very active mission that was established in 1867 and then abandoned when this land was used for soldier settler blocks after the First World War. There's almost no historical information about this cemetery. The oldest grave that's still present on site dates from 1877, and there's 26 marked graves in total within the area of the cemetery. Now, this is has become a very important place for the Lake Condah Aboriginal community. There's a very long association of families with this cemetery, and the community are now have begun starting to use the cemetery again for modern burials. So from their point of view, the key question was not can you provide a catalogue of all of the unmarked graves on the site, but can you provide a map of where there's any subsurface disturbance where we shouldn't put any new graves. And this is complicated in this case. So the area had become completely forested after it was abandoned. And as you can imagine, the impact of tree roots and then tree throw as trees die and fall over with their roots intact is really destructive on that soil stratigraphy that we're trying to image with GPR. So it's a really challenging research question. But what we did in consultation with the community is essentially mapped all of the areas where there was some degree of subsurface disturbance. We were able to identify a number of discrete unmarked graves that we're quite confident in as individual items, but what was mapped for most of the site instead was this soil disturbance. And I can say absolutely hand on heart that most of this is related to tree disturbance, but some of it certainly is related to unmarked graves. And so from a cultural heritage management and a cemetery management point of view, it's a very good outcome because it provides the community with a map of where there are areas where there has certainly been no disturbance and so are available for future burials. So moving now, I've mentioned a couple of times the Battle of Tarawa, which was fought between the American and Japanese militaries in November 1943. This is an absolute horrific battle in World War II. Nearly 6,500 men were killed on an indescribably tiny island in just a few days. Many of the American soldiers, in fact, were killed in the transition from the boats to the island. There's a very extensive and shallow coral reef, so many of the men had to be dropped off the landing craft quite a long way offshore, and then were very easy targets for the Japanese. But the Americans did prevail in the end, and in that tropical environment with not much time to organise it and a very demoralised and depleted force to undertake the work, they hastily buried the men, many in unmarked graves, and the island has subsequently become essentially completely covered by housing. The American military is very interested in recovering all of the men that were buried on the island. They've done a number of projects to do this, including during the Second World War and then afterwards. But now they're continuing to work on this question in collaboration with a non-profit organisation called History Flight that specialises in this sort of thing. So this is the island of Tarawa from our UAV surveys, and as you can see, there's absolutely no open space here. In fact, so much so that we had trouble negotiating a launching spot for our fixed wing UAV. There's an oval here which was closed to us that day, and then the police department has an open piece of open space here. I went and negotiated with the police commissioner for access to this takeoff and landing area. He seemed incredibly reluctant, which I thought was pretty strange. Despite the language barrier, I thought it was not a very significant request. Eventually, he did agree, as long as we were in touch with the airport on the neighbouring island and got their permission. I realised at that point that I'd somehow convinced the police commissioner to let me land an actual plane rather than a drone on his oval, which was quite impressive, I thought. And then once he realised we were just flying a drone, everything was fine. So yeah, very difficult place to do detailed geophysics. But a very interesting opportunity. There's a wonderful archive of historic aerial photos from the Second World War, on which you can see the graves in many cases, or they've been marked by subsequent studies. And by comparing the few extant features on the island that are still present from the Second World War, we were able to georectify the high-resolution images from the drone and locate these features again, and then do geophysical survey. But this is really challenging. You need to work in amongst all of the buildings and use a combination of geophysics, a cadaver dog, and an excavation to try to solve this problem. And in most situations, this would be an impossible research question for geophysics, but fortunately, the excavations on the site to date have shown that most of the bodies are buried with some sort of military hardware, helmets, grenades, rifles, belt buckles, bullets. So these sites are absolutely full of metal, and so using GPR and making plan view slices has proved quite an effective reconnaissance tool for locating areas of interest. Again, it's a different application. This is certainly not body detection in the conventional sense, but it's just narrowing down this incredibly complicated survey area, providing some targets, and then moving forward with excavation. Okay, another really interesting burial detection project that was undertaken in collaboration with the Ngarrindjeri community on the Coorong. We had been working with the Ngarrindjeri for some time using geophysical techniques to clear areas for the repatriation of skeletal material out of museum collections. And the Ngarrindjeri were very eager to have these remains reburied on country, but to not disturb any of their other ancestors which were in the sites. And then during those investigations, we found this eroding scarp in the landscape where skeletal material was being exposed on the surface. And the Ngarrindjeri requested that the site be excavated, the skeletal material be catalogued, and then reburied with some stabilisation taking place to ensure it wouldn't erode again. We took this opportunity to do a geophysical survey prior to the excavation to see how we could approach the site. And this is a really challenging place to do this sort of geophysics. This area has been absolutely decimated by rabbit burrows. So the stratigraphy of the site might have been difficult in the first instance, but now it's a complete mess. So GPR or ERT would just be completely ineffective in this case. However, there was a really interesting opportunity. We know from the ethnographic observations of Ngarrindjeri people that burning was an absolutely central component to funeral rituals, and there's a drawing of this on the slide. And in the picture of the site here, there's a frame that we have interpreted to be one of these burial platforms. And basically what would happen is that after somebody had died, they were placed on a platform and smoked for a period of months, potentially. And that we were interested to explore whether this long-term firing of the soil might lead to a magnetic susceptibility or a magnetics anomaly based on the formation of maghemite in the soil profile. We were also encouraged in this area. There's very little evidence of occupation in this specific part of the Coorong. There's no middens or stone artifact material. And the Ngarrindjeri interpretation of this was that this was a burial place specifically and not a place that people were living. So we were hopeful that we would see an association between burning and these burials. And that turned out to be the case. So it's this is a detailed image of the site. There turned out from the excavations to be 2 burials. But one of those burials, burial 2, was split into 2 separate parts. The original burial was burial 2B, and then seemingly some material had eroded out of the dune and then been reburied as burial 2A, which was a collection of a few long bones that were brought together and put in a separate spot. You can see there's an association between the magnetic anomaly, which I've just drawn on the photo here, and burial 1. And then the magnetic susceptibility anomaly covers burial 1 and burial 2B, and does seem to be eroding slightly down the hill as well. The really interesting part of this research was that there's no anomaly associated with burial 2A. And our interpretation from that was that that is a post-contact reburial of part of the remains, possibly quite recently. And so the smoking ritual had not taken place associated with that feature. So the final project that I'd like to talk about today is the latest version of the search for Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont. I'm certain everybody in Adelaide knows this story very well. But these 3 children disappeared from the beach in Adelaide. They were seen in Glenelg at a bakery and then never found again. And this is seen as a really significant event in Adelaide history. It's sort of identified as the time when the sort of innocence of Adelaide as such had disappeared, and that people didn't feel that they could let their children move around as unsupervised as they had in the past. And there's been very many searches for the Beaumont children over the years. I've been involved in a couple of them, but this one was particularly interesting. So there was a witness who was still alive, who was paid by a person of interest who owned the Castalloy plant, which is just near the airport in Adelaide. He'd been paid as a young university student to dig a large hole on the site on the same weekend that the Beaumont children had disappeared. There's quite an amount of circumstantial evidence linking this individual that owned the Castalloy plant to the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Not least, his son had accused him of undertaking their abduction and murder. So the SA Major Crime Squad others were very interested in investigating the site. And in fact, a few years prior to this project, had done a GPR investigation just the other side of the building that you can see in the image here. It really was a challenging thing, and I felt terribly sympathetic towards the witness. The landscape in this part of Plympton has changed obviously quite significantly. Most of the Castalloy factory has been built since that time, and so he was I think quite reasonably a bit challenged by finding the exact location where he did this excavation so many years ago. So I was approached to do this project and would have normally used GPR, but you can see in the image of the site at the top right of your slide that there's quite a slope from the building down to the fence on the right. And that slope is entirely anthropogenic fill that was brought in to raise this kind of historically swampy area up high enough to build the factory. And that fill was introduced to the site after the Beaumont children were allegedly buried there. So we needed to use a geophysical technique that could see through 2 to 3 meters of possibly quite complicated fill down into the ground surface underneath, and then identify that ground disturbance that might have been associated with the burial. So we did do some GPR on the site, and as expected, there's extensive, really disturbed, really difficult fill to see through. It's really not very instructive in this case. But more interesting was the ERT survey. So the ERT certainly showed the extensive fill on top, but was able to identify the ground surface underneath, and was able to identify some features in plan view that were of interest to the investigation. So the feature that really piqued our interest and the interest of the police was this central feature here. So there's in fact 2 next to each other, one that is an almost perfect 2 by 2 meter square, and then another that was a 2 by 1 meter square that really had a very good association with where the witness had thought the feature had been dug. So obviously there was absolutely nothing in this data set that could identify whether this feature was associated with the burial of any human remains, and certainly not specifically the Beaumont children. But based on the correlation between the data and the witness, the police decided to proceed with an excavation. What happened next was an absolute media frenzy. So somebody leaked the fact that it was going ahead to the media, and then the site was absolutely swamped with cameras during the excavation. In fact, one of the television networks live streamed the entire excavation, filmed from a crane looking over the fence. So I've never been as conscious of not scratching my ass in the field as on this occasion. That's for sure. The results were very interesting from a technical point of view. There was a organic rich, a very moist feature of the same size and shape of the things that we'd seen in the ERT. It had quite a lot of bone associated with it, but unfortunately it was a domestic rubbish pit rather than the location for the Beaumont children. So the search certainly continues. But I think regardless of the specific outcome of this investigation, the ability of ERT to locate features that would be of interest and can help narrow down this search was really nicely demonstrated here. So just to summarize, I've talked about a lot of case studies today, but really the main message that I want to get across is that these sort of geophysical techniques provide a really useful means of identifying unmarked graves, whether it's in a forensic, an archaeological, or a cultural heritage management context. They're certainly much faster than digging, non-invasive, and relatively inexpensive compared to the need to undertake a forensic or archaeological investigation of these sites. The geomatic techniques have been transformative for this and have made this process much easier. And me and my students are working on this on many sites at the moment. And as I said at the start, if you have some skills in geophysics and you're interested in doing research in this area, I'd be really thrilled to hear from you. The question of what's next I've been asked many times, and the research question that I'm looking to investigate now is the sort of next stage forward in the burial detection situation. So, I mean, I think doing geophysics in its current form over well-defined sites, so where there's a absolute survey area or a known cemetery is one thing, and we can do that quite effectively. The next question, and one that I've been presented with by a number of communities, is when they say, look, we know that there's a grave somewhere in this paddock or down this fence line. Can you find the graves there? And really that becomes cost and time prohibitive to do using conventional geophysical techniques. And so I've got some students working on at the moment is doing some automatic recognition of topographic features from drone surveys. So looking for depressions or elevations of about grave dimensions, and using that as the first filter to then move to doing geophysical surveys on those specific areas. So I'm really excited about that as a way to extend this work to another degree of coverage for future surveys. And then finally, thank you very much to the organisations that have supported this research. Thank you to ASEG for the opportunity to give this talk today. And I'd be thrilled, I see there's a few questions coming through, I'd be thrilled to take questions and talk about any aspect of this in more detail.
Fantastic, thanks Ian, that's super interesting work. Yeah, as you say, we do have a few questions coming through. I should mention as well, thank you Ian for doing this as a webinar, because we did originally have him scheduled to do an in-person talk right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So thanks for being flexible on that. So first question that came through was from Koya Suto, when did disappearance of the Beaumont children happen?
Hi Koya, great to hear from you again. So the Beaumont children disappeared, I'm just looking this up actually, so I get the right number, but it was on Australia Day in 1966.
Okay, from Kim Frankham, for fire-induced hematite, have you considered soil hysteresis measurements? Handheld meters exist and have been used to help diagnose SPM in EM surveys.
Kim, thanks, great question. Yes, we've done some laboratory-based analysis of soil hysteresis for some of these investigations, particularly from rock shelter sites. But I didn't actually know about handheld meters to do this in the field, and I'd love to get some more information about that. If you're able to pass it on, that would be fascinating.
From Tundi Adekoya, given that the GPR interpretations were mainly based on subsurface soil disturbance, how reliable were the interpretations?
That is, Tundi, is a very interesting and difficult question to answer. So what you would do, obviously, in an ideal world, is to ground truth all of these or many of these targets with excavation, and really have a rigorous look at how many of these geophysical anomalies do correspond to burials. We've tried to fund that research before, and and had the usual ARC response of no thanks. And it's something I'd like to pursue. But I wonder if you, from my point of view, if we step outside of the strictly research question here, from the point of view of the cultural heritage management of these sites and the communities that are involved in this research, my view has always been that if we take a conservative approach to the GPR and perhaps we identify a few features that are not graves but that can be used for their for the management of the sites, that's still a better outcome than doing the geophysics, than not doing the geophysics at all. I think that we need to continue to think of geophysics in the same way as we might in a mineral prospection project, as just being another tool to filter through information. So there's absolutely no doubt that some of the graves that I've shown in this presentation, if we dug them all up, wouldn't in fact be people. They might be other soil disturbances. But yeah, I think that still doesn't mean the geophysics shouldn't be done. I've got some great students. In fact, I've got a student at the moment who is a former professional grave digger who's now turned to geophysics, and he's doing some geophysics on graves that he's dug himself to see how they respond. And he's doing some really interesting research. In fact, I should say, funded partially by the ASEG Research Foundation, to investigate how known graves change in visibility based on different rainfall and soil conditions. So yeah, there is some interesting research to be done in that area. Then in terms of the processing, so we do our processing either in reflex or GPR slice, and really we do pretty unsophisticated processing. So just basic bandpass filtering, background removing, and some tweaking of the gain, and that's normally enough for seeing these stratigraphic disturbances.
Thank you. From Doug Roberts, what about the use of LiDAR to detect subtle topography? Yeah,
Doug, another great question. I'm really excited about the prospect of that. So that relates to the photogrammetry image that I showed. The thing that's perhaps steered my research slightly away from LiDAR in the past is just the cost of mounting those units on drones and my poor record for crashing drones in almost any environment. But now I've just seen this week, DJI have put out a small LiDAR unit, which is less than $1,000 and can be mounted on a consumer grade drone. I'm very, very interested to trial that. The advantage of that approach, as I'm sure you know, is the ability to see through the vegetation. So one of the issues with using the photogrammetry is if the grass hasn't been cut or there's some tree coverage, it's very difficult to see the topography on some sites, and that should get around that issue. So yeah, thanks. A really pertinent comment.
Okay, from John Taylor, what is the maximum depth detection from a full 3D ERT cable layout? Is there an equation based on cable and electrode spacing to calculate depth penetration?
Yeah, another great question, John. Look, it depends slightly on the specific array that you're using for your survey, but a good rule of thumb in general is that you'll get about a third of your depth will be about a third of the maximum cable layout. So I think for the Beaumont site, we were doing a cable layout of about 30 meters, and we were getting about 10 meters of depth penetration in that case. There is another related concern here. Of course, the sort of resolutions that we're trying to achieve for these surveys and other archaeological surveys are almost ridiculous from an exploration geophysics point of view. So quite often we'll be using electrode spacings for ERT of 20 centimeters, half a meter or a meter. And so you do need to ensure that you preserve the resolution to image those features despite having the length of cable layout to get the penetration that you need.
Okay, there's a couple which perhaps you can follow up with after, just requiring your email address to get you in touch with people.
Yeah.
So Clive Collins, in an early photo, you showed rock slabs fallen from the roof of a rock shelter in Arnhem Land. Were any buried ones recovered, and has there ever been earlier rock art evidence on these?
Yeah, thanks, Clive. Great question. That's the slide was the site of Garbamung, which is up on the Arnhem Land Plateau. Just an absolutely stunning place that was discovered really by accident by a chopper pilot that was flying past, saw the glint of the ochre. It was the subject of a number of excavations by a team led out of Monash University, and I did some GPR as part of that work. And the issue of the rock slabs and the rock art is a really interesting one archaeologically, for two reasons. One is if you're in the sort of combined space of an archaeological excavation, so many archaeologists in Australia will dig in a 1-by-1 metre pit, it can be really challenging to understand if when the excavation hits the bottom, hits the rock, if that's just a big slab, or if you have in fact if you've actually hit bedrock on the site. And this is something that I've been working on for the last few years as part of a research project, and Geophysics can really make a big contribution to this. So to siting the excavation, to stay away from rock slabs and ensuring that you get into the deepest part of the site. So yeah, it's a great question from that point of view. There was evidence of ochre recovered from some of that rock, but no actual pieces of figurative art as I remember. Similarly, I think at the Carpenter's Gap site in the Kimberley, there was some ochre found on blocks in the site, but as far as I know, there's not, I'm not aware of a case where there's been a slab with a really obvious figurative piece of art, but I think of course there has to be some in some of these sites, and it's a really interesting way to link the archaeology of the site with the rock art, which has become a really really very vibrant area of research in the last few years.
So from Houston Lee Cooper, Ian, interesting talk. Try using community safety in your ARC applications. That might work.
I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Houston.
Mark Lackey, hi Ian, great talk. Is it possible to use 3D photogrammetry with precise location tied in to reveal sunken graves?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's absolutely. I have a master's student that's looking at that at the moment. I think it certainly will be the case that that's possible. Whether it works on a site-by-site basis, it depends on obviously the geology and the age of the graves and the specific soil. But in principle, yes, I think that would be a very effective technique for that question.
Okay, these questions keep coming. Rob Ross, thanks for a fascinating talk, Ian. You mentioned undertaking surveys in the Mediterranean. I have a relative who was buried in a march grave at Gallipoli in 1915, but his grave was not found after World War I. The geology is limestone and sandstones covered by Pliocene sediments. Are you aware of any near-surface geophysical surveys to look for lost graves in Gallipoli? Thanks,
Rob. I'm not actually. There's been a lot of work done archaeologically on the site at Gallipoli, but I'm not sure if they have done any work with near-surface geophysics in that particular, as part of that project. Perhaps the best port of call in terms of getting some more information about this might be the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who have done a lot of investigation of these sites and maintain a lot of the cemeteries from the First and Second World War. So I found them really responsive to other questions. So I would really encourage you to get in touch with them and see if they had more information.
Okay, jumping to the chat section for a couple of questions from Matthew Kelly. Interested in your thoughts on active beach and dune sand systems. How applicable are these techniques to identify unmarked graves?
So thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so I think, just to paraphrase your question, I think you're asking about in those active beach and dune sand environments, how effective GPR particularly can be to find graves there. And the answer is actually really effective. If the stratigraphy hasn't been too disturbed by things like rabbits or sand mining or something like that, even if there's not the well-developed soil profile that we might expect somewhere, those beautiful low-angle laminations that we see in dune systems very commonly, they show up incredibly well in GPR. And if they're disturbed by a feature the size of a grave, that can be really effective. So yeah, I've had quite a lot of success in those environments, as long as they haven't been subsequently disturbed by some sort of other feature.
From Tavis Lavelle, have you had any luck identifying unmarked burials in unfavourable geological conditions for GPR, such as clay? If not, what other geophysical methods would you propose?
Tavis, great, thank you. Another wonderful question. Yes, I've found GPR to be surprisingly effective in terrible conditions. The reason that that's the case is that because you're looking for the soil disturbance rather than the body itself, even if you can't get the kind of 2 meters of penetration that you might expect you need to see a grave, you can usually get at least tens of centimeters, and that A and B horizon, the very shallow subsurface, is where the soil stratigraphy is most obvious. So even in a case, and I did some work recently on a cemetery in Kingscote, which is the oldest cemetery in South Australia. It was put there by the South Australian company as part of the original settlement. The sticky clay there is the worst soil that I've ever done GPR in under any circumstances. We had to clear the wheels nearly every line, and I was never more happy than to have a bunch of eager PhD students pushing the radar as I sat under a tree with a coffee than on that moment. So that it was a terrible site for GPR nominally. We got very shallow penetration, but because of this most obvious soil stratigraphy being in the shallow subsurface, it still can be a viable method in that case. I wouldn't like to say that GPR will work for burials in any soil conditions, but my experience has certainly been that it's worth doing the survey most of the time, and usually it's okay.
Okay, from Benjamin Thomas. Ian, have you ever trialed FDEM to recognise shallow graves? Is it possible the decomposing body would make the soil more conductive to the ground mass around it?
Yeah, Benjamin, great question. Yes, I have had some success with it. There's been some really interesting work done at Keele University in the UK, where they've buried a bunch of pig cadavers on campus. They've put them in different burial situations. So one unwrapped, one wrapped in a tarp, and one in a coffin. And then they've done regular geophysical survey over them as the pig bodies break down, and the extent of the plume and how recognizable it is in geophysics. Geophysical data is quite extraordinary. So you do see a conductive fluids moving out from the breaking down pig carcass over time. And I think that's something that would absolutely be, could be imaged with FDEM. And I have done that on a number of sites. I think the issue that I've had, which is perhaps a logistical one rather than scientific one, is just getting the data density to get a good outcome. So in that sense, GPR has been a method of convenience rather than anything else. But if GPR wasn't the appropriate method, I think EM could give you an equally good outcome.
Cool. I have a couple of questions. So do you know whether biogeochemical sampling, for example, has ever been used?
Yeah, there has been some really interesting work on this. And actually, a sort of related method, I've been lucky enough to be in the field when people are using cadaver dogs to try to locate human graves, and their ability to find them is absolutely extraordinary. So there must be some possibility to do that biogeochemical work near surface, but most of the work I've seen has been doing some sort of lipid analysis or looking at materials excavated from the graves themselves rather than as a prospection tool.
Mm-hmm. And my other question, is Time Team your favorite TV show, or do you watch it and think, oh, that's not real? Or
I will say that it's been very good for business. That's sure. Whenever I get an email asking for some geophys survey, I know exactly where it's coming from.
Yeah. And I think you've got through all the questions, but there's a few comments on the chat basically saying that your talk was very enjoyable, interesting, brilliant, and that it's clear that you're combining your passions for science and history, which is wonderful. So thank you very much, Ian, and for battling through 14 or 16 questions when you count mine. So yeah, that was really fantastic, and we'll put this up on our YouTube channel so people can refer back to it. I'm sure it will be a good reference point if anyone was looking to get into this area. So thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks very much, Kate. And my email has popped up in the chat, but if anyone wants to get in touch with me with any more questions or with any other information, I'd be thrilled to hear from you. It's just ian.moffat@flinders.edu.au.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.